The Benjamin Dixon Show is only possible with listener support. Go to www.thebenjamindixonshow.com to register for our blog and join the Progressive Army.
Welcome to the Benjamin Dixon Show. Today is Thursday, April 19th. I am Professor Matt Sienkiewicz. I'm in today for Ben, who is traveling. I am a professor of communication and international studies at Boston College, recording live from my office on campus. And I'm joined, thankfully, by the famous Max Inhofe. Hi, Max.
Hello.
So Ben's traveling, as I mentioned. We do the show a little bit differently when Ben's out. Today we've got, we're going to do a couple different things. We're going to do a somewhat lighter kind of take on the news bit, and then we're going to have a very not light interview with Murtaza Hussain from The Intercept. It's going to be almost exclusively about Syria, a little bit in the weeds, but this is an important issue that personally I have trouble understanding, so I was glad to have him.
No, it's hard to think about, and it's hard to know what to think.
Right. So it's going to get heavy at the end, and we'll probably do a little bit of some serious stuff off the top, but in the middle we'll break it up with something a little bit lighter maybe.
Yeah, but before we get to it, we were talking before the show, and you had mentioned that you actually saw Bernie Sanders give a speech on a foreign policy speech on Monday.
Yes, I was live in the room when Bernie or Senator Sanders was speaking. It was at the J Street conference on Monday down in D.C. J Street, just in brief, is a pro-Israel, pro-Palestine, pro-peace lobbying organization, sort of a left side balance to AIPAC sort of thing, an institution an institution that invites people who criticize the Israeli government. Even though it is an organization committed to the survival of Israel, which made Bernie an interesting speaker and actually a really good one. It was I wouldn't say the speech was revolutionary, but it was different. He did not pull a lot of the punches that people often pull when they are talking about Israel in the U.S.
Did he talk about the protests that are going on in Gaza?
Yeah. So, and we've had a few other politicians. Liz Warren came out and talked about this stuff with some level of sort of honesty. But for the most part, U.S. politicians have avoided this issue, the issue being the protests that have been happening on the border between Gaza and Israel, and Israel's response to it, which has included deadly violence perpetrated against people who are not armed.
Yeah.
And so I don't know how much context we need. I think it's probably suffices to say that both materially and symbolically, conditions in Gaza are very, very bad.
Yeah.
Right. Trump's actions have been inflammatory. The blockade of Gaza continues. There is but limited electricity, limited clean water. It's a really bad situation, and as a result, there have been organized protests at the border.
Yeah,
and again, the Israeli response has been to basically treat these protesters as an invading army sent by Hamas, sent by the party that controls Gaza, and Bernie was head on about it. He called it a massive overreaction. He took to task the Israeli government and sort of implicitly, or sometimes explicitly perhaps, the American government for sort of treating this as potentially acceptable or just sort of part of what happens in conflict. There was a journalist unarmed who was killed in the course of these protests, and Bernie, really went after both Netanyahu and in some ways the American government for either doing this or doing nothing to stop this. And it was interesting. I mean, it definitely showed, I think, a considerably increased willingness on Sanders' part to be critical of Israel.
Mm. Oh, what were some of the other things they talked about? You said that he mentioned Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince.
It was actually really good in this sense, right? So on the one hand, it showed a willingness to sort of realize that I think part of it was he was willing to criticize Netanyahu because the tie to Trump sort of unites a progressive or at least a critical audience, and he added to that a discussion of Saudi Arabia and the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, and he sort of to this somewhat. It was really original insofar as he took his sort of populist economic rhetoric and then showed that in the case of Gulf oligarchies, this has like a real geopolitical component to it. Basically, what he did is he kind of mocked MBS of Saudi Arabia, mocked him for his promise to put $50 million towards the problem in Gaza, and he did it by expressing that $50 million as a fraction of what he spends on other stuff.
Yeah.
So like $50 million is 1/10 of what he spent on a yacht last year. What do you do? $500 million worth of yacht, like
land a helicopter on it.
I don't even know if. I feel like the yacht would have to be made of dollars. Like I don't know how, but it was what was really good about it was that on the one hand, he showed this as a regional issue, right? He was able to. I mean, because often when we talk about Israel, Palestine, solutions to the problem, it's like, oh, there's these two players, there's the Israelis and the Palestinians, and then there's the Americans who mess it up or whatever. Yeah. But of course, there's more to it than that, and one of the issues is, can the rest of the Arab world play a productive role? And this was frankly funny, which is weird to be funny in this speech, but he I thought was productively funny in showing that there is reason to look beyond that binary to try to figure out what the problem is. Right? There are a lot of problems, and clearly, to be totally clear, in this speech he gave Israel, and Israel's response, in particular to these protests, was the primary problem. Yeah. And this sort of other primary problem, can there be two primaries? Maybe not. Now there are. The other is the blockade of Gaza, right? Which is the Israeli and Egyptian governments keeping materials out of Gaza so that the Hamas government can't use them ostensibly to make weapons, but in the process creating awful living conditions. So those are the real problem. But he also included that there are other problems, right? And that there's a wide range of sort of structural, global, political, economic issues that exacerbate the conflict. Mm-hmm. And he got that across, I think, really clearly, really sharply. And I think it also really, I hate to turn it into a horse race thing, but it really suggests that an aggressive way of talking about foreign policy, which looks to me like, at the very least, wanting to stay relevant for a long time, and possibly wanting to stay relevant for a rather specific purpose, right? Yeah. And, he did effectively tie this speech. Not only was it about, Israel and Palestine, but it was about American foreign policy and America's seeming inability to do things through diplomatic channels. And sort of accused the U.S. in some ways of falling into these same patterns of violence that we see in the Middle East. And again, that is it's a good point for one, that especially now, right? Diplomacy is like the last thing. We like don't have diplomats anymore. Yep. We don't have ambassadors, whatever. It's kind of an easy point to make in a way. But he transitioned from the specific problem that actually is not directly an American problem, even if America is implicated, but used the speech to transition into a discussion of what he wants to see from American policy. I got to say, I liked it.
Yeah, sounds like it. I
really liked it. Yeah, no, and I want to be... I mean, you could nitpick here and there, but man, Israel's not an easy thing to talk about. Regionalizing an issue that people think of as like a one side versus the other thing is tough. Transitioning that into a discussion of bigger U.S. issues was really good. And like I said, it didn't... It was probably a little too wonky in some ways for like a stump speech, and it was about foreign policy. But it was definitely somebody who wants to be taken seriously at the national and international levels when it comes to foreign policy stuff, which is not what he was going into the last election. Yeah. Right? That wasn't it.
Yeah. Well, he seems to kind of occupy a unique space in being able to criticize Israel the way that he does.
Oh, no, 100%. I mean, Bernie being a Jewish guy from Brooklyn, is important. And his position is palatable to a very large swath of the American Jewish community. If you take that position as being a robust defense of the existence of the State of Israel and a robust critique of the actions of the Israeli government, and also of the Hamas government, also of the PA government and other Arab governments as well. But he sort of packages that in a highly critical way that works. It's going to trip some wires with American Jewish constituencies, but much less than if you had some other person representing that or being more clumsy with it, which he's actually, at least in that speech, for being as critical as he was, it was pretty sharp.
Yeah.
Which it's like a narrow bridge to cross, and he did it. So, that was my Monday and Tuesday, it's nice to be able to relate that back to the audience. So let's do this bit. It's a bit.
Yeah, it's a bit.
It's a bit. Is that okay?
Yeah,
we're doing a bit.
Absolutely.
So it's a bit. It's based on something that I did on an old radio show I had, but it's also a way of talking about current events. Let's not set it up any more than that. Let's just cut to that and get in a couple other current event stories into the episode today.
All right.
And now we're going to try something a little bit different here on the Benjamin Dixon Show. I used to have a radio show, a college radio show back in Pennsylvania, and we would have a segment on it. The segment was called What Blogs Are Saying with Josh Moss, which dates. Makes clear that this is not recent that I was doing this.
Yeah.
But there's this guy. He's a comedian and a sort of a funny person in multiple ways, and I mean that in the best way. His name's Josh Moss, and I've got him back on the line here for the 2018 edition of What Blogs Are Saying with Josh Moss. Josh, you there?
Hey, Matt, it's good to get the gang back together, even if it's just me and you on the phone.
Yeah, no, that's quite a gang. So, Josh, I have a question and then a follow-up. So the first question is, there are still blogs?
Well, I mean, there are pictures of blogs on Twitter that you can sometimes click, and that's basically what blogging has become.
Right.
So
something you link to on Twitter.
It is. Yes, it is. But that's it's a form of blogging. It's blogging 2.0 times 4.
All right, and then my follow up, which is really it. To be clear, this is just a way of getting at some news stories. Josh, what are blogs saying today?
Well, all right. There's a lot. Well, as every day, there's a lot of stuff being said on blogs, but a big one is LeBron. America's sweetheart. It's kind of getting
I like
backlash.
LeBron. I like LeBron. I'm a LeBron guy. Max, are you a LeBron guy?
Yeah, I like LeBron.
Where do you stand?
Well,
before you give your take here, Josh, where do you stand on LeBron?
Oh, I'm pro LeBron.
Okay, all right.
And his, I'm pro the total LeBron, but he has become a divisive figure in these times because he has been political, and that in sports,
Yeah, that's right.
Laura Ingraham said, "Shut up and dribble."
Right. Right, so, he's divisive in multiple ways, right? One, he actually has a politics, and two, he sort of has been individualistic in a way that a team sport guy maybe isn't allowed to be so loudly, right? He went and played for the team he wanted to, and so on. So he's got his politics, he's got his willingness to stick his neck out. What's going on that blogs have felt the need to talk about?
Well, he had a show that took place in a barber shop. Like a talk show, a small little talk show he did. Then Alabama premiered one, so he sued Alabama and Nick Saban for doing that show.
Wait, he sued the University of Alabama?
His people sued Alabama for doing this show.
The University of Alabama, not the state.
Yes, not the state, the University of Alabama.
Okay.
And, there was a lot of backlash to LeBron. Side note, he's actually now being sued by, this is new blog. This is like latest blogs. Like, he's being actually sued by the people who supposedly came up with the idea itself. But that's let's keep that out of it because that's actually it's a little too legalistic for this is not a legal blog.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
This is general blogging. So he sued Alabama, and it created a lot of anti-LeBron sentiment about why is he, why can't people just, he didn't invent the barbershop talk show. Come on, LeBron. Like,
okay, so he's taking
the coolest thing.
If I'm getting it right, he's taking credit for something which is not terribly inventive, right? That many people have thought of many times. Is that basically it?
Yes, he is Gene Simmons trying to copyright the term OJ for orange juice.
See?
That happened.
All right. Okay. No, that totally does. That is a very good explanation. Okay. And so what blogs are against him in this case, I take it? Well, yes,
because it's, and it's ironic that Nick Saban is now the likable figure in this site because it's a stupid little idea. It's just people in a barbershop talking, and LeBron has made it, it's kind of the worst aspect of LeBron, which is taking something which is frivolous and silly, and now it's very serious and litigious.
Do you know who Nick Saban is, Max?
Yeah.
Okay, so Nick Saban is the head coach of the Alabama football team, and just a weird, unlikable man.
Yes, although I think it should be noted he is 5'8".
Yeah, he's small, though I'm not sure that the height shaming is relevant in this instance.
It's relevant for what's coming up.
Oh,
next on blogs. That's my segue.
That's a great segue. Speaking of 5'8" people, Josh, is there anything else that blogs are saying?
Yes, there is something else blogs are saying. So everyone who follows James Comey knows that James Comey released a book recently. And in that book, besides his scathing takes on Trump in general, he did attack Trump personally in very Trump-like ways. For example, he attacked Trump saying he was shorter than he expected, although Comey is 6'8", so that most people are shorter than he expects in a way.
Comey is 6'8".
He expects everyone to be his height.
Comey is 6'8"?
Yes.
Wow.
Yes.
Does that change anything for you, Max?
Not even a little bit.
I don't know. For me, it kind of does. It's funny. I really rejected the Nick Saban being short being relevant, but now I'm reconceiving the entire past 2 years of American politics based on the fact that James 6'8".
It's pretty tall.
6'8".
6'8".
I mean, how tall is LeBron? About 6'8", right?
LeBron is listed around 6'8", 6'9". So
blown transition there. I totally messed it up. I just assumed James Comey would be closer to Nick Saban in height. Yeah. I don't know what kind of ist that makes me. But so what are the blogs saying about James Comey?
Well, besides going after him for his height, he also said his hands were average size. And so some people are saying it's kind of sad how James Comey, former director of the FBI, has actually been brought down to trumping Trump. Within the way that Trump would attack someone else, So a lot of blogs are saying how it's kind of, why did he have to go there? Why couldn't he just attack his integrity and whatever else?
That's because they're blogs, right?
Yes.
Nobody's going to click on the blog that says that. Okay, yeah. All right, so he did the clickbaity thing, and then the blogs got to be self-righteous about the clickbaitiness. Is that more or less it?
Yes. He did what the blogs wanted, but as anyone knows, when you do what a blog wants,
that's when they go for you.
Get the blog, yeah, they go for you. The classic blog trap. But,
all right, that's good. That's I learned a lot. A lot. All right, so that's what blogs are saying with Josh Moss. Josh, thanks for joining us.
All right, no problem. See you again.
All right. That go okay, Max?
Yeah, I thought it was good, actually.
All right, so thank you to Josh Moss for coming on and filling us in. Transition, not easy here. Some of that stuff was at the very least important, but not nearly as sort of serious and heavy as what we're going to do now. So let's go to our interview with Murtaza Hussain. We'll talk Syria. We'll try to make sense out of what is frankly senseless. Mm-hmm. And now we have the honor of bringing onto the show Murtaza Hussain. Murtaza is a national security journalist at The Intercept, and he's joining us from New York. Thanks for being on, Murtaza.
Thanks for having me.
So, Syria is what I want to talk about, if that works for you. And for me, I rarely feel so conflicted. Might not be the right way of putting it, but just not sure what I think. I have a number of firm opinions. I think Assad is a terrible guy who's been killing his own people for ages. I'm pretty confident that he is behind these recent chemical weapons attacks, but yet I have a hard time forming a kind of coherent, cohesive opinion on the American response, what it should be, what I should pay attention to. What's your general take on things at the moment, Murtaza?
Well, I think that there's an investigation which is going on into what happened with regards to this latest chemical weapons attack. The thing is, when I think about this, there have been dozens of chemical weapons attacks in Syria, and the OPCW has investigated them every time. And if you look at the results of previous investigations, they've routinely found that the Syrian government perpetrates these chemical weapons attacks. So at this time, you look at who has the capacity to carry out such an attack. There's only one side of the conflict which has the capacity to manufacture chemical weapons, to deploy chemical weapons from the sky. So it's not by any means out of the ordinary or something that it's questionable who's carrying out these attacks at this point of the conflict. There's one military against a range of militias which are inconsistently armed or inconsistently prepared to confront a military backed by Russia and Iran in this conflict. So I think that, there should be investigation, there will be investigation, but we also have to look at the result of past investigations to see what the pattern is at this point. So I think the question of who carried out the attack is something which in a way is indeterminate, but in another way we can sort of safely assume what happened here as it's happened before.
Yeah, why do you think we're so caught up in it? I mean, you could say, well, we should know what happened, but as you know, we have a good set of case histories, right? We know what's happened in the past. Why do you think, especially in America, particularly on certain parts of the left, we're really caught up in this question of sort of, what was Assad's motivation and this and that, trying to find ways to maybe doubt the fairly apparent facts of the case? Why do you think we're sort of caught in that debate?
I think there are two questions which are being conflated here. There's the question of whether the attack was carried out by the Syrian government and whether the U.S. or other international parties should intervene in Syria militarily. Now, you can be opposed to intervention in Syria militarily, and I think that a lot of people who are opposed to whether or not the Syrian government carried out the chemical weapons attack. The issue is, when the two questions get conflated and people who oppose intervention, they go and start trying to debunk what happened here really, who was responsible for the attack, who are the people who were being targeted in the attack, what is their character like, and it becomes an effort to debunk the argument on terms which are not the terms that are appropriate to do so. So I think you can say, if you're against intervention in any case, you can just say you're against intervention in any case, and this is the reason, and this is what the alternative should be. When people who are against intervention start trying to engage in atrocity denialism as a mechanism for doing so, then it becomes controversial and it muddies the waters unnecessarily. I think the people who are against intervention, that's a totally fine position, which I think at this point I totally share as well. The issue is, what are the means and mechanisms of making that argument? And sometimes they can get into a place which is problematic and it ends up in a controversy which could be avoided.
Well, what's the way to do it then? If you say that you're somebody who is against intervention, what are the proper ways of making that argument from your perspective?
I think the most persuasive case against intervening in Syria, and which has been the case throughout the conflict, is that Syria is not like, let's say, Libya, that does not have any friends internationally, powerful friends who are invested in the survival of the current government. The Russian government and the Iranian government are absolutely committed to survival of the Syrian government as it presently exists. And as much as an outside party escalates in the conflict, they will also escalate. They're not going to back down. If the U.S. ups the ante in Syria today, they're going to up the ante. The end result will be that the violence in Syria will increase, there will be the same deadly stalemate, and more people will die, and there will be more and more destruction. Now, this does not mean that Assad is good or that his victory is a great moral triumph at all. I think it's tragedy. But the fact is that the circumstances in Syria are not such that Syria is isolated from the rest of the world. There is a strong disagreement about what should happen there. And the more that one side tries to impose, or let's say the United States tries to impose its preferred solution, which it's not even clear what that would be at this point, other parties will try to impose their preferred solution, and the net result will be more violence and still no conclusion to the conflict.
I mean, is there, you mentioned that you're not sure what the American preferred solution is. Not that long ago, it was fairly vague, but it was certainly a transition of power, right? That was the sort of clear preferred outcome. Do you have a sense of what it might be? What if you, I mean, we don't get straight answers, so we sort of have to speculate. Is there an end game? Is there a strategy? Is there a method to this approach that we see from the U.S. government?
My belief is that for many years, the United States government's preferred position, regardless of what stated rhetorical position is that it prefers to have the current government stay in place in a weakened format. They do not want chaos in Syria in the sense of absolute anarchy, but they also do not want a Syrian government which is ready and willing and able to enforce its own sovereignty vigorously. If a new government came to power, let's say in 2012 or 2013, that was highly nationalist and let's say it was not amenable to periodic airstrikes being carried out on Syrian territory, and it had irredentist claims to the Golan Heights or to even other parts of what's now Israel-Palestine, that would be very problematic. The U.S. had a fine relationship with Bashar al-Assad for many, many years. And not just the U.S., but Turkey and other Arab countries as well, too. There was a brief period where, if you remember in 2011 when the uprising first began and the massacres first began in Syria, this is very forgotten history, but Hillary Clinton and even the Turkish president defended Bashar al-Assad. They were not jumping at the chance to depose him. They were saying that, no, he's a reformer, let's give him some time. Because they did have a good relationship with him. It was only through their own actions that they forcibly disgusted and alienated the entire world. And then this appetite was created to change the government entirely because they were completely unwilling to acquiesce to any, even piecemeal reforms of the country. Later on, as it became clear that it was impossible for this to happen because foreign powers are deeply invested in the current government and they're willing to fight any change at any cost alongside the government, the U.S. and other countries began to slowly acquiesce to the fact that, no, we're going to have to deal with the government in place here. Regardless, they didn't want to ratchet down the violence. At least the United States was fine with the level of violence because, from their perspective, people dying on all sides were hostile to them. They were the enemies in Iran, Hezbollah, later Russia, the enemies in the Muslim Brotherhood-style organizations and Salafi groups. So for them, I think it's very short-sighted, but they were fine to see a conflict continue on low burn, and they funded just enough weapons into the conflict to make that remain the case. And when previous chemical weapons attacks, going back as far as 2013, they did not intervene decisively. They were fine with piecemeal responses and non-responses because they're not interested in regime change. They've had every opportunity to enact regime change. They're interested in this government staying, Syria being weak, and them having the ability to violate Syrian sovereignty whenever they please. And I think we see this now taking its final form in the slow partition of the country into an American zone, a Turkish zone, and then you could say a Syrian zone deeply beholden to Russia and Iran.
When you say every opportunity for regime change, can you talk me through that a little bit?
In 2013, there was huge pressure on the U.S. government to respond very forcefully to the chemical weapons attack in Ghouta, which resulted in upwards of 1,000 deaths by some counts. The U.S. government did not, they looked for every way out of responding vigorously to that. They had this pressure to enforce the international norm against chemical weapons use, and they wanted a way of doing that, but they wanted an out which would preclude them from having to change the regime or bomb the regime to the point where its stability would be in question. And Russia helped provide that out. by purportedly transferring out chemical weapons remaining in the country, which later evidence has shown not to be true, or it could be incomplete at least. So they are happy with violence in Syria and instability in Syria to a manageable level, but the U.S. has never intervened decisively on one side of the conflict. Unlike Russia and Iran, they've intervened decisively, particularly Russia, when they began providing air support to the Syrian army. They intervened decisively on one side of the conflict, which the United States has never done.
So if I could just go back to the airstrikes over the weekend, I'm wondering if you think that these kinds of airstrikes, the ones that happened over the weekend or the one that has happened last year, do you think that they're effective deterrents against the use of chemical weapons, or are they purely just like for show?
I think they're absolutely not an effective deterrent. I think that one of the biggest tragedies of the conflict is the deterioration of international norms against chemical weapons use, against the widespread torture, the commission of war crimes, whatever shaky norms existed, and of course they existed inconsistently and imperfectly, have suffered a grave blow because you can see that you can use chemical weapons with impunity now. That norm, however tentatively began to come into existence, is no longer the case. And I think that these attacks, they're not a deterrent. They're by no means a deterrent. The government knows that they can get away with carrying these attacks out, and they'll get sort of a perfunctory slap on the wrist, which is not in any way a meaningful threat to the control of the country, but merely an attempt by the United States to try to signal that it's still relevant or it's still in some way a preeminent power in the Middle East. Although I think that you're clearly seeing those days come to an end, and these attacks, not to say that they should attack more forcefully, but they're just a simple reflection of the reality that the U.S. influence in the Middle East is waning, and a new alignment is coming into play with Russia and Iran are much more important powers. And these attacks are just, I think they're signs not of strength, but of diminishing strength and diminishing influence.
So is it fair to say that the only strong, truly effective possibility would be sort of full commitment to regime change, probably something that's a wider spread military engagement, maybe a on the ground war? Is it binary? Is it a full in and or not at all? And what we're doing now is basically not at all?
I think that they should not bomb. They should not have carried out these airstrikes. They should absolutely not invade and depose the government at this point. That would, as I said, it would escalate the violence and probably not be successful anyways. And even if it was successful, the level of carnage that would entail and the uncertain aftermath would hardly make it desirable or worth it. I think that they should not have carried out these attacks. They should find some way of extricating themselves from the region, or from Syria at least, entirely. The problem is that, it's not so, even if you look at it from a leftist perspective, it's not so clear what should be done. I think they're very, very troubling questions which I would like to see an answer to, namely with regards to the Syrian Kurds. Because the Syrian Kurds, if you look at it in a certain way, they're the most progressive militant force in Syria. Not to say that they're objectively very progressive, but in a bunch of very bad options, they're one of the least bad options. And not only that, they were the United States ground force fighting ISIS. They were the ones who were armed and given the most support, contrary to popular perception that the U.S. has been backing rebels seeking to depose Assad so vigorously. The group that they've backed most vigorously and most forcefully, and with air support, most importantly, have been the Kurds, or the PYD, or YPG. So now, if they leave, the Kurds fought these battles for them, they helped defeat ISIS. If the U.S. leaves entirely from Syria, the Kurds are going to be crushed. They're going to be crushed by Syrian government, Turkish government. Everyone's against them.
Which is an old story, right? I mean, this is the story of the first Gulf War. It's a place that the U.S. has put the Kurdish people in previously.
Exactly. So, is it a moral standpoint from a leftist perspective that these groups should now be abandoned, having performed the service of defeating ISIS? Maybe it is. Maybe they should stay. But that means that the U.S. is going to have to be militarily involved in Syria, and they're probably going to have to carry out airstrikes and support this group. with force to prevent them from being destroyed. So that means that the U.S. can't leave Syria because they have to defend the Kurds. So
a fairly similar story to Afghanistan, in the way that I'm sort of hearing you. Does that sound right?
Yeah, they've created an edifice now that their leaving will cause to collapse violently. So one way or another, they got involved in Afghanistan, they got involved in Syria, and they created a very shaky sort of system in some places that is only sustained by the continued presence. So people who are against intervention, like full stop, they need to grapple with the consequences of the fact that removing intervention is also going to result in some violence. So that's not to say that you shouldn't withdraw from Syria, you shouldn't withdraw from Afghanistan, but there has to be if you care about the people of these areas, you have to articulate a strategy for withdrawing that's not going to result in bloodshed or betrayal of people who are just trying to survive in these areas as well, too, and have survived because they've been used by the United States for a certain purpose, such as defeating ISIS or fighting the Taliban or what have you. So I think that the question of U.S. involvement in Syria is a very complicated question now because of the decisions that have been taken before.
Murtaza, thanks so much for taking the time to join us and work through these really difficult, complicated ideas. How can people find you if they want to find out more?
You can follow my work at The Intercept, and you can also follow me on Twitter at @MAZMHUSSAIN.
Thanks so much, Murtaza.
Thanks for having me.
So that's going to do it for today's episode. I want to give big thanks to Josh Moss and to Murtaza Hussain for joining us, and to Max for joining me.
Yeah, you're welcome. If you want to follow me, you can find me on Twitter at MaxMillionaire.
And I am at Media Studied. Ben will be back with the next episode, and thanks very much for listening.
Yeah, thank you for listening.
The Benjamin Dixon Show is only possible with listener support. Go to www.thebenjamindixonshow.com to register for our blog and join the Progressive Army.